And so after having looked in detail into tariffs, we would like to look into all other policies that may have an impact on trade, but are not ordinary customs tariffs. And what do I mean by this? Well, let's have a look into two examples. For example, if you want to export coffee beans, there is a requirement in some countries that the ochratoxin level should be lower than 5. Well, I do not even understand the unit. Has to be below a certain threshold. Or another example, virgin coconut oil, there needs to be a label to the best before date on it. We all know this if we buy products. So these are requirements on food products that ensure the safety and the hygiene standards of food. That has an impact on trade. If you find a label on it, like a fair trade label, or the Kimberley certification, Kimberley, we'll get into this whether it's mandatory or not. But a fair trade label is not mandatory. So it's a consumer requirement. Many consumers want to have products that are organic or fair trade or so, and it's voluntary. It's not imposed by the government. And that makes it then not a non-tariff measure, but it then is a sustainability standard. Another example, if you import cars, motor vehicles, there's a certain requirement on the efficiency and the emissions of cars. So that is another example. But there are also, and these requirements, we call them technical requirements. The objective is not to have an impact on trade, but the objective is to protect health, safety, and the environment. They will have an impact on trade, and they have a cost of trade, and we'll get into this. But the objective here is not to have an impact on trade, normally. It may be misused. We can discuss this. Some countries may go beyond what is scientifically justified to protect their own market. But normally, the idea of these measures is not to have an impact on trade. So we call them kind of product requirements or technical measures. Then there is another second group of non-tariff measures, and these are the so-called non-technical, non-tariff measures, traditional trade policy measures, quotas, price measures, contingency measures. For example, there are safeguard measures under the WTO. If there is a flood of imports and that threatens your national industry, you can have an additional tariff. Or if you think and you can show that there is dumping in your country, you can have an anti-dumping tariff. So these are all non-tariff measures that are fall into the second category, which is kind of the traditional trade policy measures. And here the objective is to have an impact on trade. So that's the objective, to have an impact on trade. So these are non-tariff measures. There is a globally or widely agreed definition of non-tariff measures. So it's all policy measures other than ordinary customs duties that can have an impact on trade. It's a fairly neutral concept. We don't say it has a negative impact on trade or a positive impact on trade, and in fact it can have both a negative and a positive impact on trade. And we do not prejudge whether that's legitimate under WTO or it's not legitimate, so that we don't, this definition doesn't say this. Many of those measures, those non-tariff measures, are positively linked to sustainable development. So we have done a mapping together with our colleagues in UN SCAP in Bangkok, and we see that 40% on average of all those non-tariff measures are positively linked to some of the sustainable development goals. For example, prevent young people to smoke. So toys are not allowed to have the shape of a cigarette or so. So all kinds of these measures, and that would be then positively linked to the SDG on health, and so on. So most of the NTMs are actually positively linked to the Sustainable Development Goals. What's the impact of these non-tariff measures? If they are so positive and important for health, for safety, then they cannot be eliminated. So that's not an option to eliminate them. And they often have very legitimate public policy objectives. But nevertheless, there are costs incurred with this. Well, one is information costs. So you have to know, if you export water from Fiji to the United States, you have to know what are the requirements that are needed in this market. And that's not easy to find out. The United States, they have such hundreds of thousands of pages, literally, which says kind of the requirements that food products have to fulfill. It's not easy, and you cannot just search for, say, you are an exporter of water or an exporter of tomatoes. You cannot search for this because it falls under agricultural products, then it may fall under food products, and so on. So it's really not easy to find this. But we'll come to this transparency in a minute. There are information costs. We have compliance costs, so you have to comply with the requirements. And then you have to prove compliance. So you have conformity assessment costs. There is this anecdotal evidence that honey produced in Afghanistan and that was exported to Norway. They had to stop the exports, even though the honey was very clean, was very hygiene, fulfilled all requirements, but they couldn't prove in an economically way that it fulfilled all those requirements, because there are no accredited laboratories in Afghanistan to prove exactly these requirements. So it's actually very, very costly, these non-tariff measures. How costly are they? Well, they are more costly than tariffs. They may be 3 to 4 times more costly than tariffs, as you see here. In agriculture, for example, on average, tariffs are around 7%. The non-tariff measures cost, if you convert them or estimate as if it was a tariff, then that's around 21%. So that's a very high impact of non-tariff measures. Well, if we disaggregate this, the costs of non-tariff measures, then you see which ones of the non-tariff measures matter most. And here we see that SPS for agricultural products has a huge impact on the costs for good reasons, as I have said, right? I mean, we just have to deal with those requirements, but they impose a high cost. Then we have technical barriers to trade, which have a large share of these costs. And then relatively small, we have these kind of traditional trade policy instruments, which add also another layer to the cost of non-tariff measures. But they are considerably smaller. In developed countries, like the EU, United States, Japan, this share of SPS and TBT is higher, whereas in many developing countries, the share of these other non-tariff measures is higher compared to SPS and TBT requirements. But we do see here from where we have to put a lot of attention to. NTMs can be costly, and countries impose their own non-tariff measures on their imports. But then, as the representative from the NGO has mentioned, also if on exports they face certain non-tariff measures, and that is costly then on the exports. And as we can see here, that can vary. For example, countries like Latin America also, they face relatively high costs on their exports, here around between 7 and 8%, whereas on their imports they face only around 5%. That's due to the composition of their trade. They export a lot of agricultural products, where we find a lot of and relatively high costs of these non-tariff measures, whereas they import more processed goods like cars and so on. and we see lower non-tariff measure costs on those. So they really vary from country to country, and I'll come to this back in a minute. The number of non-tariff measures is rising. We have to be a bit careful with this message because the data collection wasn't as good in the past as it is now, so we do not actually have all the information about non-tariff measures in the, say, 80s or so. But while one indicator is the number of notification to the WTO, because WTO members have to notify the changes in the SPS and TBT regime to the respective committees in WTO. But it's also rising, and here, sorry, this is not SPS and TBT, I made a mistake here on the slide. These are the second category of traditional trade policy instruments, which is collected by the Global Trade Alert here, and they show that the number of discriminatory measures that has been taken has increased significantly since 2020 or 2019. Whereas the number of liberalizing measures has been relatively stable. There has also been a small increase, but the number of discriminatory measures outweigh that of liberalization measures. So we see here technical measures, SPS TBT, is increasing, but also these traditional trade policy measures, there is an increase in the number of this. Well, why is this so important for us, and why does UNCTAD play big attention to this? Well, because these technical measures, SPS and TBT, they have a high fixed cost element. If you are a company like Nestle, for example, they trade a lot of coffee, of course, and we know they're based in Switzerland, which is one of the largest trader in coffee. They know what are the requirements in the market, so this information cost is relatively low for them. But a small coffee producer in Ecuador or in Colombia, for them it's very difficult to find out the information and to meet all the requirements. So we have a high share of fixed costs that come with these non-tariff measures. And we found that LDCs are disproportionately affected by these non-tariff measures. So in fact, in one study, we find that they lose 14% of their exports, LDCs, due to non-tariff measures, because they cannot meet the standards as other developing countries can. Women are disproportionately affected, that we have shown in a study. And even though the policies are written in a neutral way, they may have a disproportionate effect on certain groups. Also, small companies are disproportionately affected, and we more often find those in developing countries than in developed countries. So there is a difference in the cost that is occurred with these non-tariff measures. That's why we deal with this. And I mean, as I said again, it's not a bad intention or so. It's just by the nature of these measures that the costs are different for different exporters. So that's why we look at this. And we have a program on non-tariff measures, and I don't have much time, so I will go through this rather quickly. But just to show you what we do, well, first we have developed a classification. So we have a very clear understanding, together with WTO, World Bank, OECD, other international players like FAO, how we classify non-tariff measures. So, for example, SPS measures is Chapter A, and then prohibition of imports for food requirements, for example, is A1, and so on. So we have a clear understanding of the concept of non-tariff measures. Then we do collect data. So these 100,000 pages that I just mentioned for the United States, we literally read all this for you, and we classified this. So now you can actually look for, I want to export tomatoes from Kenya, and then you look into a database that shows you all the regulations in the United States European Union or any other market that you are interested in, and it shows you like what are the requirements that you have to comply with. We disseminate the data through various channels, and then we conduct research. For example, the research why non-tariff measures matter so much comes from this data collection, and we provide policy support. So we support countries in coping with these requirements or designing their own policies. For example, we have requests from recently acceded countries that recently acceded to the WTO, which we help to design their non-tariff measures, SPS and TBT, and typically we advise them to use international standards and so on. So that's our program. I explained the international classification of non-tariff measures. Our data collection, so we read all the national legislation and we code this into a very easily accessible database. We have a very good coverage globally. We have 95% of global trade that we cover, and we disseminate this information through 3 different channels. One is for policymakers, one is more for traders together with WTO and ITC, the Global Trade Help Desk. And for researchers, we disseminate the data through WITS, called WITS. Our own dissemination tool, which is called Trains Online, provides also additional information, like what's the coverage ratio, for example, for every country. We show what's the share of their trade that is covered by at least one non-tariff measure. So that gives you a good indication to start from. Also, it helps the negotiators. If you negotiate a bilateral or regional trade agreement, you can look into what are the requirements or the measures that your trading partner has. But it also provides you a good overview of your own measures. I remember when we did this data collection in New Zealand, they said, it's excellent. It's the first time that we have a really good overview of all our measures, because some measures come from the Ministry of Health, some from the Ministry of Agriculture. There is partly overlap, and even smaller, well-organized countries find it very useful to have this kind of comprehensive mapping. So, voila, we have the costs. And what can we do about those costs? Because we don't want to eliminate non-tariff measures. We all want to have safe toys for our kids. We want to have safe food. So what we can do, one low-hanging fruit and one which is not so low-hanging. The low-hanging fruit is transparency. There is a study by OECD that shows that only better transparency can already reduce the costs incurred by non-tariff measures by up to 25%. And I put here OECD because I want to give also a neutral scientific study, because we have done also a same study, and that we have more 20% or so, but that doesn't matter. It's a significant share with which trade costs can be reduced by only having better transparency. And our own transparency initiative does very well into it. Then regulatory cooperation. If you cooperate, if you use the same standards, that can reduce costs significantly without compromising on the non-trade objective that you have. Because having different standards and different requirements in every country makes it very costly for the producers to fulfill this, even though the level of requirements may be very similar. I will stop here and hand over to Santiago on voluntary sustainability standards.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Santiago Fernandez de Cordova, and I'm glad to be here. I was sitting in the back because I have a cold, so I didn't want to be too close to others. I want to talk to you today about voluntary sustainability standards from the perspective of market access, in particular for developing countries. And there's 2 ways of seeing the issue of voluntary sustainability standards. We can probably come closer to, your work and the countries that you represent. First, I guess we live all in Switzerland. We all do our shopping in Coop, Migros, or Carrefour. And every time we shop there, we look at the sort of commodities that some of our countries produce, and we see this little eco label showing in a banana or in an apple or in a strawberry. And we wonder what it means, we wonder what it represents, and we also wonder in terms of, because we all work on international trade, what are the implications of voluntary sustainability standards with regards to the trade opportunities of our countries in particular, and if do they represent a barrier or if they represent an opportunity. And of course, the most important thing is, are we contributing to the SDGs or in terms of sustainability, which is one of the issues that it's normally understood about voluntary sustainability standards. Another, as I said, two important issues is the other one is for those that are a bit more familiar with today's conversations. There's a lot of talk about things that are called due diligence regulation, or some other talk about what is called deforestation or issues related to deforestation regulations, or sometimes things that are linked to human rights, labor laws, and all the things that are related with regards to the labor producing implications and human rights implications in our countries. And these are all very much linked to voluntary sustainability standards, because it is an instrument, a trade policy instrument, which is linked to the implementation of this new unilateral type of regulations that we're all quite familiar. And the way we see it in UNCTAD, we see it as sort of an emerging issue during the last decade in terms of market access. I think you heard a very two impressive presentations from my colleagues on tariffs and non-tariff measures, but more and more voluntary sustainability standards are becoming part of the trade discussions. Although, as you all might know, it's an issue that is not under WTO trade agreements specifically, and that's one of the reasons why it doesn't really discuss. But if we look at some trade agreements today, it's very much linked to it. So what are voluntary sustainability standards? So there's a definition by the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, which is a UN-led, a UN platform of 6 UN agencies, which UNCTAD is the secretariat, which basically refers to standards specifying requirements that producers, traders, manufacturers, retailers, or service providers may be asked to meet, relating to a wide range of sustainability metrics, including respects to basic human rights, workers' health and safety, the environmental impacts of production, community relation, land use plannings, and others. So you really see that everything is there, which is what also Alexandro referred to as non-economic objectives to a certain extent. You know, a lot of it is sort of the non-economic objectives, which are very much linked to trade. It's a seal of approval. Somebody approves the way things are being produced. It provides market access for developing countries if they have it. If they don't have it, obviously they're excluded from supply chains. It's also an effective marketing tool, as we know. And of course, in some cases, it provides price premiums. And of course, if we look at the way consumers are dealing with it these days, it's also consumers that are more conscious of how the planet and how are we treating the people that produce the goods that we consume. Well, they pay a lot of attention to it. A market reality because there's a larger number of them out there in the market, and here you have just the evolution of those that we consider internationally related. So there's a lot of those that are only working in your markets, national, which are not in this database. And we see that it has really increased the number to over 300 in the last decade. And of course, the reasons I already sort of alluded to them: growing consumers' awareness of social and environmental issues, companies' motivations such as brand protection, price premium, and market access, reaction to the emergence of other VSS. So here is the competition factor. If one has a certification, another one wants to have it. And of course, and there's the failure of multilateral regulatory efforts. And lastly, the government's engagements with VSS. There's governments that engage. I just want to just basically mention very quickly, before I go to this slide, the essence of some of these VSS, where they come from. They actually gather a lot of those international instruments that are already out there. So for example, we look at conventions related to human rights. We already have many conventions related to human rights. Conventions related to ILO, to workers' rights, to environmental protections, they're out there. But there's sort of a lack of implementation efforts or how to verify this, and they're just an instrument in that sense. Now, what do they represent of the market? They represent a growing portion of what we produce in developing countries, to a certain extent. Some of those very important commodities like cocoa, coffee, bananas, tea, sugarcane, palm oil, and cotton. There are many other VSS related to other issues like critical minerals, mining, or services, electronic goods. But here we just show a tiny bit of the story. And as we can see, the certification of agricultural production of certain of these commodities has increased to represent, for example, in the cases of cocoa, between 30 to 45% of the world cocoa production land is certified under one or more certification systems, one of those 350 that I mentioned before. And likewise for coffee, 1/3 of every coffee that is produced around the world is certified by one of those little nice logos that I referred to, alluded earlier. Now, what's also important is obviously we carried a sort of interesting discussions about what is the validity, the credibility of the certification systems in terms of the sustainability objectives that we want to achieve, because obviously if we're being sort of referred to as an instrument to achieve sort of environmental protection or social protection and economic, we need to understand what is here, what are we talking about. And here we have more of a mixed sort of message. First of all, what are the sort of impacts? Well, we have things related to biodiversity, climate change, deforestation. Then we have some other issues related to social, which are, for example, poverty reduction, income or wages protection, minimum wages, which I'm sure you're all quite familiar with. There's also the issue about productivity. Are we sort of supporting the agricultural productivity, issues related to other sort of non-monetary impacts, which is health, child schooling, gender inclusion in the sort of productive systems. And these are included in sort of the objectives of VSS in not general, one more than other. And of course, there's issues related to trade volume, demand, and transaction cost. What does the evidence tell us? And here we look at sort of, we've done sort of a review of what the literature tells us. This is mostly the academics, because obviously it's very difficult to collect data of what are the impacts of this VSS on the ground. And of course, it's also very naive to believe what the same certification systems are telling us. So the best proxy is obviously to look at what the academics are looking, and there you see that there's a large number of studies that have been done in the last decade, which some positive results in terms of evidence, quite strong in terms of environment, a bit more also in terms of socioeconomic impacts, some negative impacts, and obviously some indifferent impacts, where it's a question about, it's like some things it doesn't come up as really an impact in terms of the objectives that they're trying to achieve. It's really very context specific. There's a lot of trade-offs, and of course there's also the question that we ask ourselves is the conditionalities. I'm gonna just let you know that we have done a mapping of this exercise of these voluntary sustainability standards against SDGs. This is a mapping of design, not of implementation. So design is what they're designed, not what they're really implemented. So of course, if the VSS referred to SDG 1, here is a mapping. And it's interesting because it is linked. There's a relationship. But let's look also a tiny bit about the challenges of VSS adoption. So for you to have, I'm sure you're quite familiarized with some of the challenges that can come up for many of our developing countries. there's the issue of cost of certification. Certification carries a certain cost, and depending on the level of production of the farmer, this cost can be higher with regards to his benefits, proportionally or less, and this can be an excluding factor for many SMEs or small farmers in our developing countries. But once you are certified, I guess it also gives you a competitive advantage with regards to those that are not certified. And this is something clearly in certain sectors like coffee, cacao, and we have seen this. There is also an issue about the governance gap. I mean, who sets this certification? Who sets the rules of the game? And this is something that we in UNCTAD pay a lot of attention, where we try to really work on the dialogue where the South should have a say in, and it shouldn't be just sort of civil society initiatives from the North kind of implementing on how these things need to be designed. The issue about the design, and here UNCTAD has paid a lot of attention. The other sort of challenges for the VSS adoption is obviously lack of incentives to engage. There's no excessive funding that comes on this, and of course sometimes there's sort of a social political influence. I want to give you a taste of where it is VSS today in public policy, and of course in trade policy more and more. Of course, we have referred to the issues about market access requirements if you don't have a VSS under certain those things that we refer to, EU deforestation regulation and things like that, which is more linked to number 4, which is sustainability due diligence, which you already heard a lot about the EU due diligence regulation. So it is a question that is very much linked to the market access conditions of the developing country products being placed in the global supply chains and how they integrate into the global supply chains. Now, today more and more, and I'll show you a couple of slides, it's already included in FTAs and in PTAs, and this is a reality. Then you will see that there is a bit of a contradiction, a conundrum, where it says, no, we cannot discuss it under WTO rules, but it's already being negotiated and included in FTAs and PTAs. Then again, there's the issue how it relates to public procurement. You know, the public procurement is a fundamental part of development, and it's a lot of money out there, and it's also included in how public procurement is being done in the North. But most and not least is also a question about export promotion, where many sort of developing countries feel that they need to really carry a certification to be able to promote their exports to the North. We have looked extensively about VSS in international trades. I can refer to a couple of publications there if you have the time and the energy to read them through. But a couple of the issues is they can be an enabler to trade, you know. They can be efficiency gains and enhanced production measures and volume effects. There can be price premiums in terms of the export value. They can be some sort of lower transaction cost and compliance with public standards, especially in the importing country, and they can actually have some effects in terms of product diversification. But this is also very specific with regards to the context of where they apply, the supply chain, and the level of sort of integration into the supply chains. But then again, it comes out that trade facilitation is fundamental in terms of how we deal with voluntary sustainability standards. As I mentioned, today we see more and more VSS in FTAs, which I will show you a graph in the next slide. But they also can represent, and this is something that for those that are more familiar in terms of trade history, tariff history, it's sort of, there's huge discussion about GSTP, GSP, preferential systems, but today we do see in some trade agreements that are negotiated north, south, south, north, the fact that they're included as a preferential tariff element, where you get duty-free tax tariff if you sort of certify your palm oil production system under a logo system under some specific trade agreement, which is already mentioned there, and probably you've already heard about it. I had twice the same slide. The next slide shows you how much this has been increased in history during the last decades. This is the number of trade agreements in force. And we see that it's been constant with regards to no inclusion of any kind of relation to any kind of reference to sustainability, governance, ecosystems. This is how the OECD refers to a lot of these initiatives regarding to sustainability related to environment and social issues. But more and more, the last blue line, the top line, we see specific reference to sort of VSS in these trade agreements, and that's quite interesting in terms of a trade development. So I think, yeah, I've already mentioned a little bit of the opportunities and challenges, and there's also one issue that I would like to refer is to also the issue about how do we look at this in terms of harmonization and in terms of also the multiplicity of standards, and also the issue about what is the role of developing countries in the dialogue of the sort of sustainability metrics. I want to let you know that in UNCTAD we support this program on VSS specifically in the trade division, but we coordinate the United Nations Forum on Sustainability Standards, which has quite an extensive research and dialogue facility in terms of the impact of voluntary sustainability standards on trade-related opportunities of developing countries. This is a program where you see all the agencies represented there. Mostly has been very much in place because many developing countries have come front to UNCTAD and many other agencies where they feel, okay, we're talking enough about tariffs, we're talking about non-tariff measures, but we need to really see what is the impact with regards to our trade opportunities. And we already support a number of national platforms, initiatives over 25 countries around the world, which are part of our network in terms of the work related to voluntary sustainability standards. And we have been able to produce some very nice or important research with regards to developing country constraints, which we call them the flagships reports. We've already produced 6, and mostly the main importance of these flagship reports is the implications for developing countries with regards to this. Thank you very much.